So now we're just going to start traveling down the digestive system. We'll visit a little bit of the anatomy, though a lot of that you'll be responsible for in lab, but we want to tie that in with the physiology because, of course, structure and function make the most sense together. So here in the oral cavity, we have a lot of structures that you're probably very familiar with: teeth, the tongue, salivary glands, those sorts of things. And we actually have quite a few different functions, right? So this is where sensory analysis, or taste, is going to take place. So one of our special senses located here on receptors on the tongue. This, of course, is also where we begin the mechanical processing of our food, or chewing. We also do begin some limited chemical digestion. Sorry, the technical term for chewing, did you pick up on that one? Mastication. I can't say I've ever heard someone use that in real life, other than maybe making a joke using it. So it's good to know, so you get the joke. But chewing, chemical digestion. So what we'll see is that in the oral cavity, we do begin a little bit of digestion of carbohydrates using salivary amylase. Right, that's the enzyme that we'll see digesting carbohydrates. And then also a little bit of digestion of lipids by lingual lipase, an enzyme that's actually produced on the tongue. We'll also see the really important role, function here, of lubricating the food that you eat, right? If you're going to eat dry saltine crackers, we need saliva that's being produced here in the oral cavity. So speaking of saliva, let's take a look. So you have three main types of salivary glands. The parotid gland, this is a paired gland kind of out here close to your ear. And the parotid gland makes about 25% of your saliva. We see a duct leaving that gland. It comes out somewhere near the second molar. If we look at the saliva here, one of the important components from this particular gland is the salivary amylase that we just talked about. You also are going to have, where are they? Sublingual glands, right? So we see these actually lying along the base of the tongue on either side of that lingual frenulum, the little line underneath your tongue. So sublingual. Glands, right? And these don't play a huge role. So they make about 5% of your saliva, and they're going to produce a lot more things like different buffers and lubricants that they're adding to this pool of saliva in your mouth. Now, far and away, the biggest producer of saliva is the submandibular gland. This is going to be up under the mandible, right, along that kind of angle in your jawline. And if you've already done the math, yes, this contributes about 70% of the saliva, right? Lots of things here, different buffers, mucus, more salivary amylase, are all produced here. Now, some of you are familiar with this submandibular gland because the duct that comes out of that is the one that exits right at the anterior edge of that lingual frenulum. In fact, if you lift your tongue and look in the mirror, you might be able to see this opening. This is the gland that lets you gleek, that lets you, if you practice, which apparently boys in high school practice, shooting that saliva out from under your tongue. Submandibular gland. That won't be on the test. All right. Now, all together, again, this saliva is super important, right? It's lubricating, moistening the food, adding some of these enzymes, and you make somewhere between 1 and 1.5 liters of saliva per day. Again, if you look at the components of that saliva, it is mostly water, right? Over 99% of saliva is really just water. But we did say there's also some enzymes. We talked about the amylase, but we also do produce in here some lysozyme, which would be part of our innate immune system trying to kill microbes, right? We mentioned buffers, mucus, which is just a glycoprotein component. We do have in our saliva some antibodies. If you were going to find an antibody on a mucous membrane, you might expect that that antibody would be IgA. Good. Okay, so some antibodies, all these kinds of things, right? So saliva is really getting us started here in the oral cavity. From the oral cavity, we then move to the pharynx, right? So again, this is that oropharynx. This is that shared region with the respiratory tract, right? And from there, right, and it's not super exciting. We'll talk about swallowing here in a minute, which it is involved in. And then the food is going to very quickly move on to the esophagus. And the esophagus, right, is this basically this muscular tube that food is going to move down to get to the stomach. So in this picture of the esophagus, they're trying to show you, right, these same layers that we said are throughout the entire digestive tract. And really, if you look, this muscularis externa is really prominent here, and we are going to see peristalsis to move food down through the stomach. A couple other things to note on the esophagus. At the, you can't really see it on this picture, right? But you do have to recall that separating the thoracic cavity, where the esophagus is coming down, and the abdominal cavity, where the stomach is, you have the diaphragm, the dome-shaped muscle that was helping us breathe. The esophagus is actually going to have to pass through the diaphragm. And so there's a little kind of hole that the esophagus passes through. And this is the hiatus, right, or esophageal hiatus. Again, this is a hole in the diaphragm. When someone, if you hear of a hiatal hernia, this is referring to this opening for the esophagus, basically kind of getting enlarged, torn open. And then when we talk about a hernia, it's always just something protruding into a space that it doesn't belong. So the stomach can actually start coming up through the diaphragm. The other thing that occurs right here, right, is the lower esophageal sphincter. And this sphincter is just a band of smooth muscle that needs to open in order for food to enter the stomach, and then really its job is to close up and make sure that food, as well as the acids and enzymes, can't re-enter the esophagus. Now, to move from the oral cavity down to the stomach, which is next, we do have this action called swallowing. We all take this for granted. It happens totally without our thought. And it really happens in 4 different phases, right? So the first is the buccal phase. And in the buccal phase, the bolus of food, right? So you've been chewing, you've been mixing in saliva, and your mouth is kind of packing this bolus, blob of food. And it's going to, as it moves to the back of the oral cavity, when it bumps into the uvula and the soft palate, that is going to trigger this swallowing reflex. One of the neat things that happens here is those receptors in the uvula are also going to send this message to the medulla oblongata. Sure seems like the medulla oblongata is in charge of a lot of things, but this is actually brilliant. So the medulla is going to trigger this reflexive swallowing activity, and it also inhibits the respiratory centers, right? Which makes sense because you can't swallow and breathe at the same time. When you do, you aspirate things and you start coughing, right? So food is going to be moving then into the oropharynx, and we're going to then enter what's called the pharyngeal phase. The key thing here in the pharyngeal phase is that we actually see the epiglottis fold down and cover the larynx, right? So we don't get food into the respiratory system. That is the role of the epiglottis, right? And at the same time, we'll see that that uvula is basically preventing food from entering the nasopharynx, right? So both of those drastically increase the comfort of swallowing food, right? From there, food is going to move down into the esophagus. And in this phase, really, what we're focused on is peristalsis, the wave-like contraction of smooth muscle pushing that bolus of food down the esophagus. If you didn't notice this when you were in lab last time, take a look. Remember, the rings of cartilage on the trachea are incomplete, right? They don't close all the way on the posterior side of the trachea. It's open, and that's where the esophagus sits, so that the bolus of food can kind of push into that space of the trachea as well, because we're not breathing at the same time. From here, food is going to enter the stomach, and in this final phase, the key thing is that lower esophageal sphincter needs to open to allow food into the stomach. Okay. Again, this entire process really is a reflex. The sensors in that buccal phase relate to the medulla oblongata, and everything else is then going to happen reflexively, right? Without thinking, without additional information needed. So our food has now made it to the stomach. The stomach is going to be a place for storage. We'll also see mechanical as well as chemical digestion taking place here. Now, in lab, you're learning all the different regions, cardia, fundus, body, pylorus, right? Talking about maybe lesser curvature, greater curvature of the stomach. The thing I want to point out here that's really important is actually that as we look at that muscularis externa, right, our smooth muscle surrounding the digestive organs, we have a third layer. So now not only do we have a longitudinal and circular layer of muscle around this organ, but we also now add an oblique layer. This is actually in the muscularis externa as well as the muscularis mucosa. But in the externa, that's where it has a little bit more power. And this really sets us up not just to like pass food through the stomach, but to be able to churn in lots of different directions, which is really important in the mechanical processing here. Now, as we dive in here, right, recall the histology. We have our simple columnar cells, and you will see that, right? Hopefully as you open up the cat, you'll see all these ridges, the rugae, that are lining the stomach. And as we look in closer, right, we will see that each of those kind of folds enters what's called a gastric pit. and that pit is then going to open up into the gastric glands. Okay, so here's a close-up. We have those simple columnar cells lining this gastric pit. Okay. And as they're lining the pit, they're called mucus cells. These mucus cells, right, those are simple columnar cells. These mucus cells produce mucus. This mucus is super important, right? As it comes up out of these pits, it's going to be coating the whole lining of the stomach. It's going to protect the stomach from the acids and the enzymes that it itself is producing. This is one of those big problems with NSAIDs, Advil, Tylenol, those sorts of things. We're concerned about how those drugs actually affect the production of mucus and therefore leave the stomach kind of vulnerable to degradation, potentially even bleeding. Okay, so the simple columnar cells there are producing mucus. Now, as we move down into the gastric glands, we have a couple different cell types. These parietal cells, right, they're still simple columnar epithelium. Right, these parietal cells produce two things. One is intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is just a glycoprotein that's going to be essential in our ability to absorb vitamin B12. Right? It is not B12, it helps us absorb B12. Parietal cells also produce hydrochloric acid, and here's how they do it. I told you it would be back. Look, CO2 and water come together. The enzyme carbonic anhydrase, the same enzyme we saw in red blood cells, produces carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid is going to dissociate into, you guessed it, bicarbonate and hydrogen. The hydrogen is going to enter the gastric cavity, the stomach, right? The bicarbonate gets pushed out here into the bloodstream, right, and is exchanged for chloride, just like it was in the red blood cell. But this time the chloride is also going to enter the stomach, and so now we have both hydrogen and chloride in the stomach, and that is hydrochloric acid. Isn't that fun? Okay, so hydrochloric acid. This is going to be so important here in the stomach, right? We talked a little bit about how that mucus elevator in the respiratory system then causes you to swallow the mucus and microbes, and here we have hydrochloric acid to break them down. Right? But we also use this hydrochloric acid to activate an enzyme called pepsin. We'll talk about that a bit more. We can break down cell walls, right, to get into cells to extract more nutrients. We can break down connective tissues, right, really kind of tough stuff that perhaps we ate. It helps us to denature proteins. Again, to aid the digestion as we move on. So this production of hydrochloric acid by parietal cells is super important. We also, lining these gastric pits, have chief cells. These chief cells are going to produce an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. And it gets converted to pepsin by that hydrochloric acid the parietal cells are producing. But here's the plan, right? As these chief cells are producing pepsinogen and moving it out of the glands, it doesn't it starts to come in contact with that hydrochloric acid as it's entering the stomach, and it doesn't actually become the active form, right, until we've cleared the glands and the pits. And this is important. Pepsin is really good at breaking down proteins. Protein breakdown. And if we produced it in that active form, we would digest our own stomach, right? All of that muscle in there. And so instead, we produce the inactive form. We also see in here G cells. These start to become more prevalent as we move into that pyloric region of the stomach, the end of the stomach. These G cells are producing a hormone called gastrin. Gastrin is really going to be stimulating chief cells and parietal cells to do their job. And they also, gastrin also stimulates the contraction of the stomach wall. Okay. So when we look at how gastric activity is regulated, this happens in three main phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. So the regulation of gastric activity, figure 2415 lays it out pretty nicely. So the first phase is called the cephalic phase. Do you remember what cephalic means? Cephalic means head, right? Caudal is towards the tail, cephalic towards the head. And so what we're pointing out here is that digestive activity begins before you even start eating. It starts with the brain. So the sight, smell, taste of food actually gets the central nervous system to start preparing the digestive system for activity. So here we see nervous system innervation, right? And we're going to actually stimulate all those cells, mucus cells, chief cells, parietal cells, G cells, to get things kicked off. Let's make sure we've got a mucus layer, we've got the hydrochloric acid, the enzymes that we need as food enters the stomach. So this is before food even gets here. It's really preparation, right? And we're making all these gastric juices, right? You've experienced this before, right? Like Thanksgiving dinner's being cooked, but it's, you know, it's gonna be later because there's all this food being made and you're just thinking about food, right? And your stomach starts growling and going. Hopefully we move into then the gastric phase. And this is as food reaches the stomach, right? So notice what happens. As food enters the stomach, it starts stretching. The pH starts going up, right? All that hydrochloric acid gives us a very low pH, but we start diluting it with all the food and drink, right? And those are going to be major stimuli for us. So what we're seeing here, right, distension, stretching, and an increase in pH, those are going to be major signals for us, right? So we can think about when we talked about local and then neural and hormonal. So one of the examples here, right, these changes can get cells in the stomach to release histamine, and that histamine can trigger nearby parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. So that's just a real quick localized effect. They're also showing us then this neural response. So those receptors, right, are triggering that myenteric plexus. This is going to give all of our cells a boost to produce even more and also trigger the not peristalsis, but the mixing, the churning of the stomach. Okay. On this side, right, those G cells producing gastrin, again, that stimulates chief and parietal cells to produce more, and we also see that hormone causing, again, more mixing. So everything is happening right here in that gastric phase. Okay. The intestinal phase is then as food starts to enter the duodenum. The duodenum is the first segment of the small intestine. Now notice what happens here. In this picture, all the arrows are showing stimulation, right? And now we're seeing a lot of kind of stop signs. So as food is entering the small intestine, right, the stretch and chemoreceptors in the small intestine start inhibiting the churning in the stomach, right? And some of the hormones that are being released in the small intestine are going to have feedback on our cells and say, stop. Stop pushing food towards us and stop working so hard on digesting, right? It's reaching us. So this is a pretty clever little setup, and really what we're trying to do here is be very efficient in timing the entry of food into the intestines. The intestines are where the absorption is taking place, and so we need this to proceed pretty slowly. We don't just want everything dumped at us, and hence all this inhibition, right? So hormones like CCK, that's cholecystokinin, gastric inhibitory peptide, and secretin, right, are all causing inhibition. So let's say inhibition of the stomach, right? Both of the churning, right, the propelling, and also hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Right? Slow it all down, ease things up for the timing. Okay, before we move on then, big picture, right? Realize here in the stomach, as far as chemical digestion, I should say chem, because we do know, right, there's mechanical digestion in that churning, but this chemical digestion, right, we saw hydrochloric acid breaking a bunch of different things down. We saw pepsin helping to break down proteins, right? As far as absorption goes, it's very limited here in the stomach, right? Really, this is limited things like alcohol. There's a good example. Alcohol and certain drugs are absorbed here in the stomach. Most absorption is going to take place in our next organ, the small intestine.